Knowledge in crisis.
The podcast.
Hello and welcome to today's Knowledge in Crisis podcast. My name is Elek and I am a postdoc at the University of Vienna.
Hello everyone, my name is Tuomo Tiisala. I'm also a postdoc at the University of Vienna, a member of the Knowledge in Crisis project. Our interviewee today is a fellow postdoc, Gregor Greslehner. Gregor, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
You work in the philosophy of science, philosophy of the biosciences in particular. Can you briefly tell us a little about your background? You have both philosophy and biology in your portfolio.
Yes, that's right. I trained both as a philosopher and as a molecular biologist. Naturally, I'm interested in where those two fields overlap, also where they differ, what the different approaches are to gain knowledge about the world through the lens of philosophy and through natural science.
Can you tell us a little bit more specifically about the kinds of topics that you're working on?
I'm very much interested in philosophy of science, naturally, and one of the basic questions there is about what science actually is, what makes it special, what makes it a reliable source of knowledge. People might think that there is this exemplar prime sciences like physics, where it's hardcore facts, and mathematics, everything is exact and precise, and you make predictions and experiments. Whereas the humanities, more like history, philosophy, they operate differently, but also they claim to reliably produce knowledge by rigorous argumentation or other methods. And so we want to know, what are those methods? What are the epistemic merits? Why should we trust it? Why do we think it might be true, what these parts of science on the different spectrum produces?
On your way of looking at things then, you see two really broad projects that aim at gaining knowledge about the world. One of those we might call a kind of humanities project, where we think about literature and study history, and we produce knowledge in that way. We learn some facts about the past, or learn some facts about the human condition by reading Tolstoy or something. And then there's, broadly speaking, science. And science has a different set of methods than the humanities for gaining knowledge about the world. And you're trying to understand what exactly are the methods of the sciences such that they do produce knowledge.
And the shared goals, because even though there is this distinction between so-called hard and soft sciences, I'm not too fond of that distinction. Of course, the methods might be different depending on the subject, but still there's an overarching common strive for knowledge that's reliable, that is helpful to human affairs in some way. There seems to be a common core to all these branches of science, even though it's a spectrum, but they all share some common goals, and what these are that might set it apart from other human endeavors where we don't pursue the same goals as science does.
Oh, right, like playing basketball or something. It's
right.
Our goal isn't to produce knowledge, it's to just score points.
You have been interested in the phenomenon of pseudoscience in particular. We would like to hear a little bit more about what that means. So is pseudoscience just bad science?
One distinction we had is between science and pseudoscience. We want to tell those two apart. And another category would be bad science. And I think in bad science, people are still doing scientific things. They are just not good at it. They might cut corners, be not very rigorous. They don't bother to double check and take at face value what might have just been an accidental result. They might be influenced by a different goal. They're not trying to find the best answer, but the one that best suits their preconceived notion of what their scientific model should be. But they're still in pursuit of science. Whereas in pseudoscience, they are not at all even trying to produce anything scientific. They're just trying to gain money, interest, attention, and they take these scientific credentials on board, phrases, terms that sound scientific, to signal that what they are claiming is backed up by the best science of today. So that's what we mean by this epistemic authority, pretending to be scientific without actually sharing any of the scientific goals. That's what puts you into this field of pseudoscience. You could also just say fake science, so it's something that pretends to be science, something that masquerades as science. And why would that happen? Why would someone pretend to be scientific Well, that's because by pretending to be scientific, you claim this epistemic authority. That's something people should listen to and take into account.
I'm wondering if you could give us a kind of example of something that you would count as pseudoscience, and then how that might differ from an example of bad science, just to get really concrete about these concepts.
Great question. So in the academic debates, there are the usual suspects like homeopathy, astrology, intelligent design. Then there is, more interestingly, some borderline cases where we're not so sure where to put them. Something like string theory, some would say it's bad science, some would say it's even pseudoscience, doesn't create predictions, it hasn't allowed to test new things, but no one would call themselves a pseudoscientist or a bad scientist for that matter.
To what extent do you think that the distinction between pseudoscience and science comes down to the kinds of attitudes and approaches of the would-be scientists behind these fields? So it's not exactly that we can just say, well, this person is trying to study the relationship of constellations and star charts to personality effects, like astrology does, and thereby identifying the pseudoscience in terms of its content, but rather in terms of the way in which the people who are working on this area are responsive to things like correction.
That's exactly right. I think the shift we will need in the pseudoscience debate. Historically, philosophers of science have tried to find so-called demarcation criteria, so demarcation being exactly the separation between science and pseudoscience. And there the focus has been on the claims being made in the areas of pseudoscience, but I think that's the wrong target. It is really rather the epistemic attitude, so what people are trying to do, what their motivation is for doing what they do and claiming what they claim. With astrology, thinking back in the history of science as well, when Johannes Kepler was working, the boundaries were not so clear. He was writing horoscopes to earn money for a living, and you would not call Kepler a pseudoscientist. He was one of the greatest astronomers of his time.
That's a very interesting case with Kepler. Newton is another one. He also spent at least as much time on alchemy as he did with physics. So you said that scientists pursue goals that are different from the goals of the pseudoscientists. But we all pursue knowledge. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I still pursue knowledge. And arguably everybody wants knowledge, but not everyone is a scientist. Can you say a bit more about what is specific about the goals that scientists have?
A philosopher of science, Karl Popper, had an interesting idea that what sets pseudoscience apart is the kind of lack of accountability in terms of not being willing to put your theories and ideas to the test and let them be refuted if things turn out to be different from the way you thought they were. Popper said the scientific attitude would be to be willing to let your ideas die if they turn out to be wrong. What sets science and pseudoscience apart is this willingness to test and have your claims either refuted or everything turns out the way you thought it would. But that alone doesn't conclusively settle things, because how many confirmations would you need? When would it be enough to say this is now verified, as a technical term? From the logical positivists, people have come with different ideas what it means to confirm and refute things, but the basic idea of Popper is still valid, that pseudoscientists often refuse to put their ideas to the test. This is where one could draw the line between science and pseudoscience.
Since we are in Vienna, and you mentioned Karl Popper, Viennese philosopher, and also logical positivists, which was a philosophical movement in Vienna, can you say a little bit about the historical context and then what happened to Popper's proposal? So when did Popper make this proposal, and do people still believe that this is the right way to draw the distinction?
So we're talking the early 1900s here, where especially in Vienna in the 1920s, you had figures like Sigmund Freud creating his Psychoanalysis and Albert Einstein's physics of relativity. And those two might be very good examples to illustrate the way Popper thought that at the one hand we have Einstein's physics, which made very clear predictions about the future. The way light would bend at a solar eclipse would be very surprising, but he made exact predictions of how that would turn out to be, and one would just need to experimentally detect if that was actually the case. As it turned out, it was the case, but if the results from this measurement would have been different, his whole theory might have been completely refuted. Whereas Freud, according to Popper, you could just explain any behavior or psychological tendency based on whether you were hugged as a child too much or not enough. There was always a plausible story to be told why you are the way you are based on your early childhood experiences, and no behavior or characteristic trait of your psyche would ever prove him wrong. He would always be able to come up with a convincing sounding story that could explain everything and thus explains nothing. That could fit anything and is not scientific, according to Popper. Do people still believe Popper's claims? Briefly, no, not really. It's more complicated. So his famous claim that falsifiability, this possibility to refute something based on experimental data, it rules out too much and not enough at the same time. So you would also not be able to refute any mathematical theory or theorem because there is no empirical evidence ever possible to refute the theorem of Pythagoras, for example. But we still wouldn't like to count mathematics as a pseudoscience. And at the same time, falsifiability does not rule out some clear cases of pseudoscience. Creationists would say the world was created less than 10,000 years ago, and all the fossils you find are no less than 6,000 years old when God created them. And you now present me with the counter evidence, like with carbon methods, I can point to fossils that are millions of years old. It would falsify creationism. But people would not take the empirical evidence properly into account. They would come up with a story, well, the measurement suggesting that the fossils are millions of years old, that's just an artifact of God creating the world in such a way that the apparatus tells you this, but it's still only 6,000 years old.
You suggested that, at least according to Karl Popper, Freudian psychoanalysis is a kind of pseudoscience. And that's really interesting to me because it's not the kind of thing that immediately springs to mind if I start trying to think of, what I would count as a pseudoscience. For me, the things that pop to mind are, flat earth conspiracy theories, or maybe astrology. Not to knock on astrology. I do like to read a horoscope every now and again. And then, you brought up this really interesting case of creationist theories of the earth and how old it is and how things came to be on earth as they are. And you suggested that, in some sense, you could have someone who believes in creationism, who considers themselves a kind of creationist scientist, who's offering a falsifiable theory, but who we nonetheless want to count in some way as being a pseudoscientist. And that just made me wonder whether there are other ways of doing something bad as a scientist, or as someone who is purporting to do something scientific, besides just being a pseudoscientist. You don't want to be a pseudoscientist. That's a bad thing. I guess you don't want to be a bad scientist either. It's also a bad thing. Are there other ways of trying to do science, but, just doing it in a bad way or failing to do it at all? Or is it all, it's either science, bad science, or pseudoscience?
Great question. So, I think this idea that there would be a clear separation between science and pseudoscience that we could really neatly define, that would help us in a binary way say it's either that or the other. I think we should give that up. In addition to the straightforward cases where there's pretty much consensus that something like chemistry is a science and homeopathy is pseudoscience, it's especially these borderline areas that are so interesting, where we can work out what are these attitudes where one could get a check mark on the bingo list for being pseudoscientific.
You're painting a really nuanced picture here, where one of the hallmarks of pseudoscience is that someone who is engaged in pseudoscience often will see some evidence from an experiment that speaks against their theory, and then they'll just say, well, I discount that evidence. I don't care about that. I'm going to hold on to my theory anyway. But actually, at least some of the time, good scientists also do that. You see a little bit of evidence to the contrary, and you say, well, let's see if we can explain this away, or look for other evidence, or find something about the experiment that we ran that would explain this, and not just get rid of our theory. Do you think that ultimately there's a kind of spectrum, at least in some cases, between really good optimal science and pseudoscience?
That's exactly right. I think it is a spectrum. I think that working out the hallmarks of bad epistemic behavior in science and towards the other end of the spectrum, pseudoscience, is the way to go, to look at what are these hallmarks of pseudoscience.
I think we're getting close to the point where it's time to reveal to our listeners what Gregor's favorite pseudoscience is. But before that, I want to briefly follow up on one aspect of the contrast that seems to be there between the two cases you mentioned, so psychoanalysis and creationism. So it seems that Popper said that psychoanalysis is a kind of theory that cannot be proven wrong. And that's a feature of the theory. Like, it doesn't matter who the theorists are or who the particular scientists are. But in the creationist case, the theory is able to generate testable predictions. But the problem you mentioned was that the theorists, the scientists, or the pseudoscientists choose not to take the evidence seriously. So do you think that's a useful way to understand two aspects of the science-pseudoscience distinction?
In addition to that, we could also apply it to entire fields. So Popper might have labeled the entire field of psychoanalysis as a pseudoscience. But I think it's more useful to think exactly in terms of individuals. Sometimes we think in terms of specific claims. Sometimes we think in terms of how people are willing to produce theories in the first place and then revise them in light of evidence. There is not this one level where we attribute pseudoscience to fields, individuals, or claims. The best candidate, seems to me, that's shared among all these is really the epistemic approaches, the way you produce knowledge and deal with it. And that seems to be common across these levels, even though in practice we'll often call out individuals or fields or claims as pseudoscientific.
Maybe this is a nice time to pivot and talk about what Tuomo suggested we were about to get to a little bit before, and talk about, I think Tuomo said slightly ironically, your favorite pseudoscience. Greg, can you tell us what that is?
Sure. I'm very interested into the phenomenon of biological aging. I mean, we all get older. No one likes it usually. There is this quote by Jonathan Swift that everyone wants to live long, but no one would be old. There's some truth to that. And the science on aging, so-called gerontology, or sometimes just aging research, has greatly progressed in the last decades. And at the same time, this idea of a fountain of youth is probably as old as humanity itself. And this dream is, of course, now feeding on the science of aging. They will say, oh, look at this paper in Nature or The Lancet that you probably won't ever bother to check yourself. But I can, again, claim this scientific epistemic authority and sell various products or get media attention. So there is a real hype about anti-aging that I think is the pseudoscience to the proper science of aging research that I'm very interested in, because I think it creates a lot of borderline cases. The science of aging is itself rather young, and many things are not clearly set in stone what the scientific consensus is that probably allows pseudoscience to prosper.
So there is a real science of aging. Like, biologists and doctors can study the processes of aging in human beings and other animals. But because of the fact that, while lots of us would like to live a really long time and do so without getting wrinkly and weak, everything else that happens when you age, there's this incentive for people to pretend that they have cracked the scientific keys to understanding aging, and then they can try to sell you some product about eating the perfect kind of berry and nut mix in the morning that you can only get from them, or something like that. Yeah, so this seems like a kind of area where there's a legitimate science, but it's almost ripe for pseudoscientists to come in and claim epistemic authority and try to piggyback on what the real scientists are doing. Could you tell us a little bit about how widespread you think the problem of pseudoscience is in this area? I mean, should I be worried when I go to the doctor and they're recommending that I take certain medicines and do things, other things supposedly for my health?
The problem is widespread, but not in this way. The pseudoscience comes in when people really make, I would say, outrageous claims about the first person to live 1,000 years has already been born today, for which I would say there is zero evidence. But of course, the people who do claim that, we can hardly ever confront them because we won't be alive in 1,000 years. So convenient for them. I mean, in philosophy of science, we have this rule that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And we do have evidence that lifespan is to some extent manipulable. With rats and mice and other model organisms, we can let them live longer, maybe 20, 30%, which sounds spectacular. But you also have to recall they only might live for 4 or 5 years. And compare that to a human, things are not so easily transferable. That's also a key hallmark of pseudoscience, where you take things out of context, and just because it works in one organism to claim that, oh, we can just easily do the same thing in humans, that's a huge leap that's not warranted scientifically so easily.
So are you saying that medical procedures that prolong the life of rats don't necessarily work for human beings?
We don't have evidence. I mean, it works in mice, and you try it out on, I don't know, a worm or another organism. You do the exactly same manipulation. Maybe you tweak the same gene. You discover that actually they live much shorter now, even though you did the exact same thing you did to the mice. So we shorten lifespan, and no one would like that, I presume.
One recurring theme in this conversation has been that pseudoscientists are after something different from the goals of science. But science also produces a lot of useful discoveries that can be commercially very successful as well. So think about the technology we use every day, think about the internet. There is a lot of fundamental physics research in the background. And a lot of people make money as a result, and they make money because it works. So then it seems that just because someone is trying to sell you a product, that's not going to be enough for me to know that this is suspect, this is pseudoscience.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. There's so many anti-aging books. Very prominently you will have on the book cover that the author holds a PhD or is an MD, which normally you wouldn't find on academic scientific books. But sometimes it's also just a popular science book by a Nobel laureate, and of course they like to advertise that the author holds multiple PhDs as a professor, a Nobel laureate, and so on. So that alone doesn't qualify or disqualify as pseudoscience. And it's also not just the case, of course, that they want to sell a product because they think they might have discovered something and they want to share it. It might not always happen with ill intentions, but still, when the rigorous checks of how does it compared to everything else we know about the biology of aging, do these claims and suggested interventions or products really help? Is there any evidence that it works in humans? Or is it really just, it was shown in one study in yeast? Is it prematurely claiming victory to something where more randomized control studies would be needed to make a meaningful observation that it has an effect or not? Or is it someone really just trying to be the center of attention? Why do I think of Brian Johnson in this context? Like, he even has his own Netflix documentary, is very prominently on social media, creating also its own kind of religion, the Don't Die movement. So there might be multiple reasons. None of them might be with ill intent or with the goal to enrich themselves or necessarily sell a product. They do sell products in the Don't Die movement. But what is the goal and the questions they want to answer? For Brian Johnson, I think his dedicated goal is really for him to live as long as possible and share his insights with others to do the same, which would be a noble goal. but the results he would produce are scientifically not useful. He does so many different things, takes so many different drugs and interventions and routines, and they change all the time. And they might work for him personally, good for him. And even if they did work and he were to live, let's say, 150 years, which would be spectacular. I doubt that will happen. We would have a sample size of 1 and no idea what did work from the things he did, what didn't work. So it's not a scientific project that is pursued there, but something else that might be science adjacent. They have scientific advisors, they take scientific papers and try things out, but they're not doing science. There's a danger that all the attention is going to these big claims and spectacular sounding projects with the goal of becoming immortal or living hundreds of years. Whereas the a bit boring, let's try to make a large proportion of the population live a healthy 80 years. Doesn't sound so spectacular, but in fact, I think it would be very spectacular. A lot of the age-associated diseases set on much earlier, cost lives much earlier, rather than trying to really go beyond the maximum lifespan of humans that seems to be around 120 years. That shouldn't be the primary goal in aging research, and it is not, but rather studying what happens before, what can we do there to prevent early onset of diseases. If as a side effect we get lucky and humans also happen to live longer, that's great, but that would really be just a side effect and not the scientific goal of understanding the aging process. What's happening in the anti-aging movement now is really putting the cart in front of the horse and trying prematurely to apply a lot of different things that are open questions, unsure things, and the things we could do right now, on the other hand, are rather dull in comparison and might not make for best-selling books.
So one point that you made, and I think this is really important, is that just because someone is selling something doesn't mean that they're selling it on the basis of pseudoscience. Rather, it's that when you have someone who is selling something, you at least have some kind of reason to wonder, is what they're purveying good science, or is their motivation just to make money? So that seems like sort of an important note of caution for us, just as we go about our everyday lives. And so then the second point I wanted to pick up on, which is of course related to the first, is the stuff that you're saying about Brian Johnson. A few things that you said about him suggest that maybe there's something rather dangerous about the movement that he's engaged in. And I just want to understand a little better what that amounts to. One issue with the kind of anti-aging movement that he's a good representative of is that its aims might not be good aims. They might be hoping to make it so that a couple people in the world, perhaps just the ultra-rich, can live to be 150. And you might think that's just morally misguided. We should be allocating our resources otherwise. You know, it'd be really great. Let's just get everyone to live to 80 and be healthy while they do it. A second issue might just be that they're engaged in a kind of pseudoscience, or representing some of what they're doing as a kind of science, when it in fact isn't. Are these things related? Are they connected, or are there just two separate issues with this kind of anti-aging movement?
I mean, the goals is a question really to disentangle what they are. There's a diversity of them, what they should be, what goals would fall into science, what would not. And then where we want to put our scientific money, to put it that way. We already learned a lot about the biology of aging, but I think the territory that's unknown is still so much bigger. For humans, especially, there are still so many open questions. So maybe the best that can be done is this, try out what works. But the goals are quite different in the scientific questions, where we really want to understand how organisms age, what are the causes behind the aging process, where aging is really a multi-causal, complex phenomenon. And it would be either bad science or plain pseudoscience to just put too much emphasis on one causal factor out of many by saying, look, science says this is the key to aging, and now here is my intervention to make you live longer. The danger is that if there's too much money and attention on this tech enthusiasts mingling in the vicinity of science, the actual science of aging is not getting enough funding, not getting enough attention, and no one would listen when they tell you, maybe your grandma already told you that in order to live long and healthy, you should eat healthy foods and exercise a lot and get proper sleep. This boring advice does lend itself much less to making a profit in the anti-aging movement. And I think anti-aging is just the latest chapter in this rich history of the battleground, even though it's not science against pseudoscience, but the spectrum really of different pursuits and actors and projects. It's useful to be reminded once in a while what are criteria of proper science, of good science, what are the epistemic figures and institutions we should trust, and who might be out of conflict of interest or for pursuing different goals might not be the most reliable source to learn about how something complicated and interesting like aging works.
We're getting close to the end of the episode, but I would like to still hear a little bit, not about pseudoscience. So we've talked a lot about pseudoscience, but what about science and the science of aging that you mentioned has been making progress? So there are advances in the field, and I want to tell our listeners that there is a particular book on Gregor's desk that has caught my attention in the office that we share. It's called Why We Die. So I think that we're all very intrigued by this question, and it's not a book of pseudoscience, I take it, that you've been reading. So
no, it's proper science.
Yeah, so
it's very good science.
What can you briefly summarize the latest, like what's the state-of-the-art answer to this question?
Yeah, so the book in question is by Venki Ramakrishnan, who happens to be a Nobel laureate. So a lot of epistemic authority, one would think, but that's a lesson I would probably like to point out at the end, that one should not take credentials just at face value, but really see what are people doing, what are they trying to achieve, what are they claiming. And this book is a very nice summary about the understanding of the biology of aging that we, the scientific community, many scientists working for decades have unearthed over these decades. We learned a lot about the basic biology of aging and how organisms develop and grow in general. And even there in the book, it's lamented that so much attention goes to the pseudoscience, the big claims, the hype of anti-aging, where it would be so much more fascinating to engage with the science where we do know a lot of things that we could start trying to apply, yes, but the interesting, fascinating areas are where we have open questions. Why is there such a diversity in lifespans across the tree of life? Why do some organisms hardly ever get cancer? Why are all other organisms so prone to getting cancer? What has been the evolutionary trade-offs in our own evolutionary life history? These are so many scientific questions that you can also find in popular science books like these. But then there is 30, 40 how to live forever books that are just not covering any proper science. So to get a feel for what are the goals of these kind of books, what are the goals of people who claim that science has shown that this, or according to science we should do that, and to be very careful to put it in proper context, how they justify the claims. Is it really just a PhD on the book cover and the content of the book is rather dubious? That really should be evaluated at its own merits and not just for reasons of catchy phrases and titles, which are a good starting point, but there is really good science doing an excellent job to understand scientific questions about aging, and there is a ton of pseudoscience that is just out there to tell a good story, make money, sell products, and it's often not easy to tell the difference. So that's maybe an excuse for people like us, philosophers of science, looking at these things with close scrutiny and tell apart, give people guidelines for what is science, what is rather pseudoscience, even though, as we've established, it's a spectrum. But even the more, you need some navigation devices that help you get through this rather confusing territory of science and pseudoscience.
Wonderful. There is a lot in what you said already that speaks to the last question, which has to do with the practical upshot of the conversation we've had so far. So the theme has been pseudoscience, and I think it would be very nice if you could summarize what the listeners can take home, practically speaking.
So maybe one of the clearest signs of pseudoscience, as we have established, is really this cherry-picking and lack of willingness to take evidence to the contrary into account. So often when pseudoscientists or people engaged in pseudoscience are challenged, that is the critical behavior you should watch carefully. How do they behave when their claims are being challenged? Are they open to learn new things, to be shown evidence to the contrary, or are they dogmatically blocking off any other perspective, not willing to take any results to the opposite differently? Are they dogmatically insisting that they are right? The more they insist without giving arguments or being able to explain, the less you should take them seriously.
Gregor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
This podcast has received funding from the Austrian Science Fund as part of the Knowledge in Crisis project. We're a collaboration of more than 50 philosophers at the University of Graz, the University of Salzburg, the University of Vienna, and are led by Central European University. For more information about our research and details about upcoming public events, visit www.knowledgeincrisis.com. You can also find us on most social media platforms at Knowledge Crisis. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.